We bring into you key people, people that are meaningful, making and shaping this world. And today, I'm very, very excited to introduce to you somebody who's the Director General of the JCPA. What is JCPA? It is the Jerusalem Center for Political Affairs. There's somebody I can say really count. And basically, I can tell you that he has been serving as the Chief of Staff of Prime Minister Netanyahu when he was Minister of Finance at the time, right? So you clearly want to listen to him. So what did we talk about? So we cover a wide range of topics. So we talked about agriculture, we talked about healthcare, we talked about renewables energy, we talked about the general geopolitical situation and also the situation in Israel is very, very interesting. I can tell you one thing, there's more than one thing that you're going to be learning, so you want to be paying attention. But again, thank you very much for listening to us, and let's dive into it.
Welcome to Renewables in Action,
your unique podcast.
Do you want to understand the renewable energy sector, its trends, business models, and insights? Are you interested in learning about the challenges and opportunities, as well as how you or your business can thrive in this new world? Welcome to Renewables in Action, the show that helps you realize your potential in this industry, which is the fastest growing source of energy in the world. Here is your host, Tony, to you.
Okay, we are here today with Dr. Yechiel, and which is one of the key executive of the JCPA, but I don't want to say much more about that. Dr. Yechiel, so how are you doing today?
Very well. Thank you, Tony. It's good to be with you.
Excellent, excellent. I think we met, I think a couple of months ago. That was in London, in fact, twice when you were here, obviously for business reason, and we had some very good conversation. And we met through common friends, yeah. So which we both saying hi to, and I'm very delighted to have you as a conversation here. But just to make sure that everybody understands really who you are and pay attention to this conversation because it's going to be very exciting. Would you mind maybe in a couple of words introducing who you are and what is JCPA really?
Yes, well, it is a delight to be with you. I'm glad that there's a follow-up to our initial meetings in London. And here we are. I'm sitting in the middle of Jerusalem, and you're in London, and I hope that soon we'll meet in person again on one of the continents, where we roam.
Exactly.
But certainly you're invited here to Jerusalem, particularly to the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. This is a think tank, which I have the privilege of being the Director General of. And you also met our president, Dan Diker, who was with me in London at the time. And then we met again near the House of Lords, right? So we're
close to power.
We're going to bring down those lofty ideals from the House of Lords to some practical discussion today, I hope. The Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs was established in the mid-'70s by Professor Daniel Elazar, who was a world-renowned expert on federalism. As a matter of fact, he was so well regarded that when South Africa achieved independence at the end of the apartheid era, President Nelson Mandela had him flown down to South Africa, I believe, 8 times to help him construct the new constitution. And after his passing, Ambassador Dory Gold, who was one of Israel's premier foreign relations experts, was our ambassador to the United Nations, Director General of the Foreign Ministry. He was our president, and he was succeeded by my esteemed colleague, Dan Diker, an expert on the Middle East and global change. And we focus at the present time on the emerging new regionalism. And I think that's something that perhaps we can talk about because we view the region not just in terms of, Israel, the Palestinian issue, Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt, our immediate neighbors, but region in a most broad sense. And I think I could explain, perhaps, if you give me a moment, what I mean by that and why that's a important segue into the specifics that you might want to ask me about in terms of relations with Africa, Israel's relations with Africa.
Excellent. I think definitely please do so. So, quick question for you, and feel free to bring up all the points that you mentioned there, 'cause I think they're all very interesting, and it just had a snippet of it, and I'm sure I want to hear a little bit more. So you have spoken about the importance, of strengthening the ties between Israel and Africa and the whole region, as you talked about regionalism, which I've never heard of it before, actually. So can you mention some specific area of cooperation that you see as having the most potential to be mutually beneficial, for those region, and maybe especially for Israel and Africa?
Well, there's so much, there's so very, very much to say. Give me a minute or two to explain what I mean by a broad regionalism. The world, until the age of globalization, operated on the basis of regional relationships. The regions were usually pretty small relative to what we understand today. Before air travel and excessive maritime travel, advanced maritime travel, regions were very small. And of course, there was a lot of tensions over resources, natural resources, water, secure ground, and of course, access to food. In the gradual advance of globalism, which today has reached a point where, here we are in the digital age, and we're on two different continents, and we're talking as if we're sitting next to each other, right? So globalization is we've all become neighbors. But beyond that, we have to understand that globalism means that if I show you my cell phone, right, my iPhone here, with or an Android or cell phone or Apple, it doesn't really matter. But this is a tremendous example of what globalization means, because here in this iPhone, you've got 40 components from 40 different countries. Okay,
Yeah.
so you got this small little item, and yet it's comprised of output from 40 different countries. Now, how does that work? It works by shipping, right? Because water transport, maritime transport, is far cheaper than land transport, and is certainly cheaper than air transport, right? So everything is shipped. And now that's changing again, because waterways are under threat, a new threat. The ability to create an iPhone with 40 components was basically a post-World War II phenomenon, where the United States had this huge navy that sprawled the entire globe, and was set about to ensure that no world wars would happen again, that there wouldn't be piracy, and that even regional wars, local wars, wouldn't affect global trade. So in a way, the United States was responsible for China's growth, right? China's amazing economic growth, which lifted 700 million people out of poverty, because there wasn't a problem importing and exporting. But now we have a huge issue which is developing, where the United States is stepping back from its global role. This started under President Obama, and it did not cease under President Trump, on the contrary, and maybe shifting a little bit because of recent events under President Biden. But generally speaking, the United States, both from the Democratic and Republican perspective, are moving toward more of an isolationist approach to globalism, which means that waterways are going to be susceptible to terrorism, piracy, and tensions between countries and regions. This means that the basic, forget the iPhone, we can all live without an iPhone, but we certainly can't live without food. Now, here we have a perfect example of the changing world we're living in the Ukraine-Russian war. Most people don't get it. The real issue of the Ukraine-Russian war is how this is going to affect basic food supply throughout the world, because this is a local conflagration, right? But it has international ramifications, particularly for developing countries, particularly for Africa. I mean, let's just take an example of the ship last week that went up the Danube. It's an Israeli ship.
Mm.
This is a segue. This leads us into the Israel-Africa angle. I believe it was the ASM-1 ship, but it was the first ship to break the new Russian blockade since the end of the grain agreement. It went up the west side of Ukraine, up the Danube, in order to bring grain to Egypt. And it was under the threat of Russian bombing, but the United States gave the Israeli ship aerial support in case of a military attack. So here we have a situation where the West, the United States and Israel, are collaborating in order to make sure that grain, in this particular case, wheat, reaches Egypt. Egypt is, completely dependent, well, almost 90+% dependent on foreign grain imports. So, if that's the Ukraine export in terms of grain, wheat, corn, etc. If we look at Russia, Russia is one of the main providers of fertilizer in the world. If there's no fertilizer, Tony, there's very little food. I mean, remember this statistic. This is perhaps the most amazing statistic we can talk about. In the beginning of the 20th century, in 1917, when fertilizer was first discovered by Fritz Haber, a German scientist, there were 1.6 billion people in the world. 1.6 billion people. 100 years later, there's 8 billion people in the world. Now, how did that happen? I mean, think about, 5,000 years of recorded history, and we reach 1.6 billion in 5,000 years of recorded history. And then in 100 years, since the advent of fertilizer, that number quadruples to 8 billion. That's because of fertilizer. Now, if we take fertilizer, just so that listeners understand why that's so critical, because with fertilizer, you can produce in the same area, in the same land, exponential produce. So it's double and triple and quadruple, right? It can be up to 10 times the amount of produce that one piece of the same land that 150 years ago could produce, okay? If we don't have fertilizer today, half the world's population will starve. 4 billion people will not have what to eat. That's the statistic. So how does fertilizer get around the world? It gets by through shipping. So the first thing we have to understand is that we're going back to a certain kind of regionalism. And the regions are going to have to work things out for themselves. They're going to have to protect themselves. They're going to have to ensure themselves. Countries are not going to be able to stand alone, okay? Let's take the countries of the Horn of Africa, for example. Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia, South Sudan, Kenya. They're not going to be able to take care of this issue by themselves. They straddle the Red Sea, and together they're going to have to make sure that the Red Sea is navigable, that there's not going to be piracy, that Iran, for example, sponsored a terror sponsoring state, which just converted 4 tankers into terror bases, to floating terror bases in the Red Sea, are not going to be able to threaten commercial vehicles carrying energy, oil, or food, or fertilizer through the Red Sea. 40% of European imports come through the Red Sea to Suez Canal. So it's going to have to be the region. And in the region, we've got the Horn of Africa, we've got Northern Africa, we've got Israel, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, which also sits on the Red Sea, right? So here we've got suddenly Saudi Arabia and Sudan, Egypt and Eritrea, Ethiopia, with an important common interest of ensuring that the waterways are open and clean for transport. So that means that there's going to be greater cooperation. There must be greater cooperation, collaboration between Israel and African countries purely on a maritime security basis. in order to ensure that globalization continues. Beyond that, I'm sorry for kind of a long-winded introduction, but it's important. It's important to set
No,
the.
that was for me. That was very, very interesting. Especially you made a beautiful demonstration between fertilizer and birth rate. So never heard about it before. I'm sure people would have liked it. But you clearly define very well the context why people should be evolving to region, and for those regions to be peaceful, obviously, and understand each other. So rebounding on that, I just wanted to know, because you representing as well here the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, right? I'm also keen to understand a bit more in this vision of wanting to bring nations together, have a better collaborations. So, how has the center been evolving, fostering, or putting together program or initiative, to foster better connection between Israel and neighbors, and including African nations?
So that's a great question. I really thank you for it, because you moved me from the theoretical to the global to the practical, the local. We actually initiated and held a international conference, a regional conference, exactly what I'm talking about, in Jerusalem at the end of March. It was a very novel idea. There have been conferences with our newfound friends in the Abraham Accords, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain. They've visited universities here. We've had conferences, but the idea of bringing African countries and Middle Eastern countries together in Jerusalem was a very novel idea. And when I spoke at a conference in Ethiopia in November, and I talked about the need for collaboration on the issue of food security. As an Israeli, everybody assumed that I was going to talk about, tanks and planes and conventional security. And I said, I think for this particular forum, we should be talking about food security, because it's going to become a growing issue. It's a growing problem, even without famine. Just because of everything I've described in my introductory remarks. So, 50 years ago, mankind, humankind, didn't have the solutions we have today. But, Israel faced a serious water crisis in the 60s and 70s. We saw it coming. We saw that people would simply not have water. You can't live without water. And I remember as an immigrant here in 1978 that we were limited in terms of how many minutes a day to shower, and there were people who came around checking to see that the toilets and the sinks weren't leaking. We were just before a really serious crisis. And as a matter of fact, in the 60s, the early 60s, our Syrian neighbors tried to divert the rivers that supply the Sea of Galilee with water, so that we wouldn't have any water whatsoever. And that led to military skirmishes between Israel and Syria in order to prevent the Syrians from diverting the water. Otherwise, we would have been completely on parched land, and we would have died of thirst. And once Israel saw that this is where we're going, we have to solve the problem, they embarked on a dramatic program to become water independent. And today, 3 decades later, we have a situation where over 90% of our agricultural industrial water comes from recycled wastewater. And up to 70% of our water that's consumed by humans is from desalinated water. So between desalinated water from the ocean and purified water from refuse, we've become water independent. We're now a water exporter. We're exporting water to the Palestinian Authority, and we're exporting water to Jordan, which is very parched water-wise. We could help with this experience with the parched lands of many of the parched lands of Africa. And when I brought this subject up at the conference in Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa, I also mentioned, if you'll permit me, I was the only Israeli in the room, the only Israeli in the room, the only Jew in the room, and half the room were my Muslim brothers from Africa, and half the room were my Christian brothers from Africa. And I said, here we are together, in this conference hall, and we all come with our ethnic differences and whatnot. They said we all have a common father. All right, we all have Abraham. It was all, still the Abraham Accords was still, in the air. And I said, look, we have this common grandfather, Abraham. And isn't it amazing? If we read the book of Genesis creatively, the centrality of food insecurity. So Abraham, comes to the promised land. The first thing he confronts is food insecurity. He's got a famine. And the same thing with his son Isaac, and the same thing with his grandson Jacob. And it goes on to the end of the book of Genesis, where the centrality of the story of Joseph and his brothers is about food insecurity. And Joseph solves the problem of famine. He solves the problem of food insecurity. Where? On the African continent, in Egypt. I said, well, look, so there's a precedent for the Middle East, because after all, Abraham came to Israel from the area of Iraq, between the Tigris and the Euphrates, right? So we've got the Middle East, we've got Israel, we've got Africa coming together to ensure food security in the future. I said, let's do it again. Now, we have the solutions today, right? We have the solutions. We have the ability to desalinate water. We have the ability to purify wastewater. We have the ability to build agricultural networks that will that are actually operated by creative energies, renewable energies, for example, because energy is a huge problem in developing countries, right? Just look at the issue of dams, the Renaissance Dam, the tensions between Ethiopia and Egypt over the Renaissance Dam, and Sudan, and so on, and so many rural areas that have no access to energy. So, if we take the advances in renewable energies, we combine that with agricultural developments, whether it's the ability to get water where it's needed, the type of water that's needed, and the conservation of water. I didn't even mention that. Israel developed the drip irrigation system. So initially, you did sprinklers, right? You spread the water around, or you flooded fields, and that used an incredible amount of water. So if there's a water shortage, you need to conserve. So drip irrigation was developed so that you're dripping the water. There's no water waste. You're dripping it to the roots of the particular plant. And then the companies in Israel discovered that, if you had 3 kilometers of drip irrigation, the first hole and the last hole weren't getting the same amount of water. And if they kept the water flowing for the last hole to get the same amount of water, you'd have excess water dropping out of the first hole. So they developed a pressure system within the drip irrigation so that the dripping doesn't begin until the last hole gets the water. So it's with that system so that all the holes, no matter how long the piping is going to get the equal amount of water. That can be applied, obviously, but this needs a holistic approach. This is one of the things that I did personally before I joined the center. I spent 3 years in a developing country in South America, and visited quite extensively throughout Africa. You need a holistic approach. If somebody comes and throws drip irrigation to a problem, it's not going to solve it, because if you increase the productivity, then you need to get your bell peppers to the market. You need to get the tomatoes to the market. It's not going to help if you increase productivity, but you can't get it out there. Can't sell it, and you can't get it to the people who need it. You need to get the water supply there. You need the right type of fertilizer. You need the right type of seeds. We have companies here that, all they do is develop strong strand seeds so that they can withstand difficult climate issues and soil issues. There was one country that came that was involved with a project where they wanted to figure out how to grow rice without flooding the paddies, where they can have a system that would conserve water. They had the issue, and we have a system that developed in order to grow rice without flooding paddies. Just one more point before I get to the next question. I mentioned rice, and associatively, my mind is racing. I recently came back from a trip to Liberia. It was for me a very, very disturbing trip. I saw a country that to a very large extent is still shell-shocked from the civil war, the horrific civil war that they experienced. And there's just an inexplicable level of poverty in Liberia. And in talking to the Minister of Agriculture, the Minister of Finance, and many of the economists that work in the finance ministry, I learned that 95% that, first of all, that rice is a staple in Liberia. Everybody eats rice all the time, and it's all imported. So I said, look, you've got a country that's so fertile, and there's no shortage of water. And if you go to the, I said, I want to go see the supermarket. Take me to a supermarket in Monrovia, in the capital. And I wanted to see the prices. I wanted to see the packaging. I wanted to see the system. And the little bit of rice that is actually grown in Liberia is more expensive than the imported rice coming from China or from India. I'm saying there's something wrong with the system here. Okay, the system can be fixed. Why aren't we creating a system where we can grow rice locally, which would have so much of a positive ripple effect? It means that more people would be employed. It means that more people would have a greater degree of sustenance. We can grow high grade rice, right? That will provide more nutrition for the people that are suffering from malnutrition. I mean, there's so much what it would do for the economy. You can turn Liberia into a net exporter of rice in the region, right? With a little bit of creativity. The problem is policy. The problem is, they don't know how to begin to get there, because what's happening is you've got good intentioned NGOs that are coming in and throwing money at the problem. Well, if you give a machine to a subsistence farmer in the hinterland of Liberia, he doesn't know how to use the machine. And if he does and the machine breaks, he doesn't know how to fix it, right? There's no system to back up the small farmer. Israel can come with its experience. I mean, we were in the same predicament in the 1950s. We were a people not after a civil war, but after a Holocaust. And we had small farmers. And what we did was we created the kibbutz movement, where we unified the small farmer into a conglomerate, right? So that they got assistance and they were insured for income. And we produced the markets to make sure that the gradual increase in produce would be sold, and the small farmer got the support of advanced mechanization, all the innovations that came their way agriculturally. They benefited from, because as an individual subsistence farmer, they couldn't afford it. But as a conglomerate, right, as a co-op, they were insured, and they kept growing together to the point where today, they're privatizing because it's so successful. So I'm all for privatization, and but you have to do it in stages. And in a developing country, you need the right policies in order to take these innovations, which exist today. They didn't exist 50 years ago. There's no excuse in the world for 800 million people going to sleep hungry. There's just no excuse. And another 400, 500 million suffering malnutrition, because all the scientific innovations exist Okay, we just have to apply them properly. And that's even before we get to the whole issue of civil war. But I can talk about that too, that are
I think
preventing.
I'm sure we can definitely jump into that as well in other episodes. But what you've said so many things, so if I may say so, I think just one comment before I move you to the next point. I was wondering how much, obviously, could you talk about the issue of Liberia? I think there's many countries that may have similar challenges, but I believe there may be also some element of globalism, right? Consequences of globalism, because you were talking about the fact that the only local rice in that country was more expensive than the one that is exported. And that's one of the challenges as well that has led people to move more into, you know, move back into region, I sort of cynicism, yeah. But I think I'm not going to expand more of that because otherwise we're going to be spending hours and hours. But I'm enjoying talking to you. But there's so many things I want to cover. If you allow me, I'd like to talk about healthcare and medical technology because I know the first time that we met and we were, in this beautiful restaurant in London, so enjoying kosher cuisine. And healthcare and medical technology is another area we talked about. And I was wondering whether you can mention a couple of, let's say, innovation that you've seen in Israel that could potentially be beneficial from Africa, but also what you can see from Africa that can benefit in Israel, because it's about what developing, equal partnerships so that everybody feels value to the right extent.
Yeah. Well, in terms of medical innovation, Israel is undoubtedly a leader. You know that we have more patents on the NASDAQ stock exchange than three small countries combined. Tiny little countries, China, India, and Russia.
Very tiny.
Very tiny little countries. We've got more patents trading on the NASDAQ than the three of those countries combined. We're right after the United States. Now, a lot of that has to do with the existential challenges that we face. We've got to stay alive, right? And the idea of self-sufficiency. The story of the Jewish people can be used, as I mentioned before, about Liberia. And I had the opportunity to meet such wonderful people, and they asked me to speak on the radio there, and I asked the host. I said, is there still a strong after effect, even though it's some 20 years after the end of the war? Is there still an after effect? And he said, look, most people my age, middle age, grew up as children under the horrific effects of the Civil War. And I said, look, one of the things that Israel can export before innovation, because it explains our innovation, is the national experience. I mean, basically, in 1945, when Auschwitz was discovered, the prognosis for the Jewish people was not very good. The prognosis was, this is kind of like the end. They're not going anywhere. And in 1948, when Ben-Gurion declared the state against all of his advisors' wishes and advice, he said, look, we're not going to be able to make it. There's going to be an invasion from neighboring countries. And he said, look, we don't have a choice anymore. We have to be self-sufficient. And that set the stage for the development of the agricultural co-ops that I discussed before. But up to the present, the scientific research and development industries that we have here. And there's nothing more that we'd like than to share it with our brothers and sisters around the world, particularly in developing countries. So, we talked about agriculture. You asked about healthcare. We have a relatively impressive life expectancy. We have a tremendous healthcare industry that kind of works. I'll tell you a story. I had the pleasure, honor, I wouldn't say pleasure, but the honor of working with Prime Minister Netanyahu when he was Minister of Finance. And one fine day, we were, the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister were interviewing for the governor of the Bank of Israel. And Stanley Fischer, who became the internationally renowned economist, and he had come for talks with both the Prime Minister Sharon and Finance Minister Netanyahu. And he came to the Knesset to speak to Netanyahu. And just then, Netanyahu was called into the plenum for a vote. So he said to me, I was his chief of staff at the time, he says, look, sit down and talk to Mr. Fish, Dr. Fisher, Professor Fisher. I said, look, Bibi, what am I going to talk to him about? I'm not a world-renowned economist. He thought for a moment. He said, look, talk to him about healthcare. We need the right paradigm for healthcare. And I know that Netanyahu was looking for a long time to find the right mix between the extreme socialist position, Obamacare type of approach, to the full-fledged capitalist approach. And I think we've struck it. Everybody here is covered. There's participation on the part of each individual, and healthcare for the most part is good. We've also developed a huge medical tourist industry. There are people coming here from various countries and for medical treatment in many areas. I'll tell you a little secret. Even though we have an awful lot of problems from the Hamas leadership in Gaza, they've initiated attacks by missiles on our civilians, and it's quite a problem we've got. We treat the children of Hamas leaders in Gaza when they're in need of medical care at Hadassah Clinic, at other hospitals around the country. There's 170,000 Palestinians coming from the Palestinian territory into Israeli hospitals for treatment every year, and that number continues to rise. And most of that, of course, is funded by the government, because they don't have, in most cases, medical insurance. Many times we've hosted the families of Arab leaders from the region for medical care as well. So the whole national attitude of self-sufficiency and having to rely on ourselves to stay alive has also influenced the medical innovation as well.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. I appreciate that. And yes, I'm aware of the advance in healthcare and technology from Israel. And yes, I'm hoping that there will be more collaboration going there. But I cannot talk about renewables energy, isn't it, right? So although we call renewables in Africa. So let me go back to that, because that's another area I can see synergies happening, just maybe from the just the type of climate that Israel is having, and the Horn of Africa will see something similar. So can you talk about some of the successes that your country has had in clean technologies, and how you could partner with some countries in Africa, to advance the development of sustainable energy infrastructure across the continent?
Well, sure. Certainly, we're very advanced in the area of, for example, solar energy. Wind energy, somewhat less, although we do have wind energy projects in the Golan Heights. But when it comes to wind energy, we have a very, very strong environmental lobby here, and they're violently opposed to wind energy. I think that wherever it's possible, certainly we should collaborate on solar energy, its advantages, and where it can be implemented. But you know better than anyone, Tony, being an expert in the field, that we're not at a point where we can rely just on solar energy. We don't have the storage capacity, and there's all sorts of issues. I will say, though, there is an award-winning uh, initiative in Israel run by a lady by the name of Sivan Yaari. And she's just an amazing, amazing personality. And she's created a foundation which has helped bring, I believe, somewhere in the neighborhood of 800 villages in different countries in Africa, energy. And I was actually in her office. There's a laboratory where electrical, mechanical engineers work on small batteries that maximize storage potential from solar energy. So she'll come into a off-the-grid village in no man's land, in Malawi, and where they've never enjoyed energy, and there's no chance of an energy main being run out to this rural area, and she creates solar panels with high-powered retention batteries, so that a school can operate, so that the medical clinic can operate, all the public buildings, and it's brought into private homes for a certain amount of time during the day as well. So, and that's a revolutionary change. You bring a village like that energy, you lift humanity. There's the possibility of reaching the human index quotas, that the UN has decided for developing countries. There's no other way to do it. If you don't give them energy, there's nothing else is going to help. Okay. Without energy, you don't have schools, you don't have medical clinics, you don't have businesses, you don't have agriculture. That's the basis. And when I spoke to Sivan and I talked about the different things that we can be doing policy-wise, and she said, "Look, from my experience, and I think she's been at it like 3 decades, is energy, energy, energy." So we need to put the knowledge is out there, the technology is out there. We need to put it together. And again, coming back to one of the first things I said is that, well, let me say 2 things. The approach has to be holistic, because if I was consulting for another country in South America once, and the woman in charge of all the social ministries asked me, she said, "Look, we're putting so much money into rural areas. Why is it not working? We're at the same human development index we were 10 years ago and 15 years ago." And I said, "Let me take a look at your national budget," and I took one look, half an hour, and I understood what the problem was. I said, "Look, take a map of your country, okay? Take a map of your country, and with all the cities spelled out, itemized, with a dot. And then take a clear plastic overlay for each one of your ministries. So take your energy ministry. Put a dot where the ministry is spending money. And then your ministry of construction and housing and education and healthcare and so on and so forth. So when you put all these overlays on top of the map of your country, do the dots line up? If you can't put a needle through the dots, then you're throwing money to the wind. Because if you build a road here and a school there, well, the teachers don't have a way to get to the schools. And the children don't have a way to get there except, barefoot walking 3 miles in each direction. You need a holistic approach. You need somebody to overlook what the ministries are doing. So you see, what happens? This is where politics and developmental economics meets, because you're going to have one minister that he has to supply the roads to his district, to his constituents, and somebody else has promised a school to that particular town. But at the end of the day, there's not just constituents for particular ministries, particular offices. There's a country, and if you want the country to develop, you're going to have to find a way for those politicians to be able to say, "Look what we did for the country," by doing it correctly and not in a bifurcated, dissected kind of way. That's number one. Number two, even with the importance development of sustainable renewable energy, we're talking about a continent that is still less developed by far than Europe, the United States, or Asia. And the emphasis of Europeans, the European community, and elements in the Western sphere in general on ESG regulations and forcing the climate change issue in an immediate and I would say heavy-handed way on Africa is outrageous. It's just outrageous. Europe would not have undergone an industrial revolution without energy. All right. So if we were at a stage where solar energy could replace traditional energy sources, great. But we're not there yet. We need to put a lot of emphasis on renewables and keep developing them, and wherever we can apply them. And there's plenty to be done in that realm. But we should not be seeing Africa in this. It's kind of like a new colonialism. We expect you to, find alternative sources of energy as we are. Yeah, but you, with all due respect, are, advanced in the Human Development Index. You're developed more. You're industrialized, and we're getting there. We're not there yet. So I think there has to be, and I've actually seen some of the African leaders. There's a great video of when Macron visited the DRC, a few months ago, and you've got the president of the DRC kind of waving his finger at him. You didn't see that in the past.
No.
And I really understood where that was coming from. That has to be taken into account too. And I think that here too, in terms of policy, we can help. We should certainly be collaborating on that. Israel is in the family of OECD nations, of the developed nations, and we have what to say about that too. And to assist in that regard as well. So we just have to create the win-win-win situations so that we can collaborate on human development, and I can really make a difference in our lives and the lives of our children and the future in general. Energy.
I think
And by the refuse of the cows.
Okay.
No, it's an amazing factory. When you come to Israel, I'll take you up to see it. You've got to use a lot of cologne going into this factory, because I don't know how the people stay there the whole day in that odor. But all of the dung of the cows from the Golan is collected. They created a system whereby the company collects all the dung, and the dung is processed to create energy.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm gonna see, is one of his initiatives. I'm gonna actually see him tomorrow. A lot of interesting things going on. And
well, I think there's other people you need to introduce me to. I think there's a lady you talked about doing the program with different African, I think African villages. So yeah, and definitely Golan.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think I have to do that. Yeah. See, the one quick question for you before we wrap it up. So where would you like to see the relationship between Israel and Africa within the next 5 to 10 years? If you can give me one metric, because I like to be able to have this conversation with you 5, 10 years from now, and we can both sit and say, yes, we have contributed to take the relationship to this next step, as opposed to just talking. Avoid people might be saying, yeah, Dr. Yechiel, Tony, just having that's a great conversation as usual, but nothing is changing. So one metric that would characterize where you would like to see the relationship between Africa and Israel. It could be anything, but as long as it makes sense for you.
Well, what I'd love to see is that there's that we're involved in policy and practical projects in 5 or 6, and half a dozen African countries. 1 or 2 in West Africa, 1 or 2 in North Africa, East Africa, Southern District, where we actually assess the situation. We actually assess a project. We create the potential for the template. We recommend the right policies necessary, and then we kind of, I don't want to say oversee. It doesn't sound like a very good word, but just to be consultants or be involved in accompanying the project to its success. For us as a think tank, the primary involvement would be creating the policy, overseeing that the right key professionals are part of the cohort, whether it's agricultural professionals or economic professionals or business professionals in Africa, just making sure that the holistic approach is being applied. And then taking these templates, once they succeed, to the governments, local and federal governments, and saying, look, we've created this template. Let's move it forward. Let's see where else we can apply this, and grow gradually into successful projects that lift humanity, that increase our human development index, that just there's an old theological expression about the world being given in common. Some places have greater natural riches than others. Some people have more innovations that they've discovered than others, and some people have life experience and natural resources that others don't have. And I think we just got to find a way to create the win-win situation in a fair and equitable way. So I think if like-minded individuals come together to work on that, it's possible.
Okay, last question for me. You mentioned about the summit that you had in March, which was, I think, the first time where you invited, or maybe the second time. So you have to remind me there.
It was the first conference.
First time, yeah. So is it going to be annual affairs that you're going to repeat every year, or was just a one-off?
I certainly hope so. That our directors here at the center will decide on making it an annual affair, an annual summit. We actually turned it into a 3-day summit, where the first day we spent with panels and discussions and presentations, kind of the intellectual setting, and then we spent 2 days in the field, actually seeing and experiencing some of Israel's cutting edge innovations. So hopefully we'll do something along the same lines come March, April. There's so much going on in the region right now that I leave a little bit of space for a change up, for perhaps something a little different. There's promising signs, there's promising changes, and there's very troubling changes. At that conference where the whole idea began in Ethiopia in November, we had representatives from Egypt and in the audience, and I said, Inshallah, I hope that next year at this conference I'll be sitting next to a Saudi Arabian representative. That's a promising sign. There's a lot of talk about the potential for normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And if that would happen, if we could have a Saudi Arabian, we had a Saudi Arabian journalist at our conference, by the way, last March. But if we would have, some official representation this coming year, that would be great. But there are also a lot of really troubling signs. We have Iran menacing countries around it and the waterways around it. We have a civil war in Sudan. We've got a situation in Ethiopia, which looks like it might be devolving once again into a civil war in the north, the Amhara region. Got serious issues in Yemen still with the Houthi war there. Got issues in Somalia. So please God, we have enough stability that we have it's more promise than concern, and that we all get together. I can tell you that in March, it was pretty much at the start of the social unrest here in Israel over the judicial reform issue. And it was intense. The first day of the conference, we were 4 flights underground, while above ground on the streets, we had 100,000 people in favor of the reform, 100,000 people opposed to the reform. The streets were all closed. And I told the participants at the end of the day in my closing remarks, I said, I've got good news and bad news. The bad news is that all the roads leading to the airport are blocked. The good news is that the airport shut down anyway, so you can't leave. We get a lot of negative media about the reform. It's a very healthy debate in the country over the relationship between the branches of government. It's there are some extremes on both sides, but generally speaking, it's a very hyper democratic society with a very intense debate over the limits of government, the limits of the judiciary. I think it's going to work itself out over the next few months. But at least it's all being done with in a democratic fashion. There's a lot of demonstrations, a lot of roads being blocked, but nothing along the lines of civil war. And that's something too that perhaps we can export to our African neighbors and friends, that things need to be solved, not with coups d'etats and not with ethnic strife and civil war, but with intense social debate over real issues, and ultimately we'll come up with a middle of the road, via media, so that we can live together. And
Dr. Yechiel Leiter, you are the Director General for JCPA with the Jerusalem Center for Political Affairs, and I was very, very honored to have this wide-ranging conversation where we talk on so many topics, from agriculture to healthcare, to renewable energy, to the regionalism that you talk about, and also the situation in Israel. I think it was really, really, really interesting. I'm sure there are many, many colleagues from CNN that will actually be envious of me. Thank you very much for your time, and I'm hoping that we'll have another chance to have this other conversation. I'm already booking my ticket for March. Thank you very much.
Great. That'd be great. We'd love to host you, Tony.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.
Thank you for tuning in and listening to this episode of Renewables in Action. I hope you learned 1 or 2 things today. If you have, please do take action. Also, subscribe, rate, and review the podcast in Spotify or Apple Podcasts or any other platform that you like. You can reach out to me, Tony T, on LinkedIn to connect, to share your feedback. I look forward to speaking with you. Until then, may the sun be with you. See you next time on the Renewables in Action podcast.